In the final years of the Second World War, when American bombers carved silver trails across the skies of Europe, there were still German pilots who believed the air war could be won. Among them was a young fighter ace named Walter Wolfram, a man who would eventually claim 137 aerial victories, most of them in the cockpit of the formidable Messerschmitt Bf-109. Wolfram was born in 1923, too young to remember the First World War, but old enough to grow up in a Germany that glorified speed, steel, and flight. Like many boys of his generation, he was drawn to aviation early. The regime invested heavily in youth flight training programs, quietly preparing a generation for a future conflict. By the time he entered formal military flight training, Germany was already at war, and the Luftwaffe still carried the aura of invincibility forged in Poland and France. When Wolfram reached the front, he did not begin in the skies over Germany. His war began in the east. The Eastern Front was vast, brutal, and relentless. Distances were enormous, weather was extreme. Airfields were often primitive strips carved from mud or snow. Soviet aircraft came in waves, sometimes flown by barely trained pilots, but in staggering numbers. For a determined and skilled fighter pilot, this environment created opportunity. The tempo of combat was intense, and engagements were frequent. Pilots could fly multiple sorties a day. Survival depended on instinct, aggression, and discipline. It was here that Wolfram began to build his score. The system under which German fighter races operated was different from that of the Allies. The Luftwaffe kept experienced pilots at the front for as long as they could physically endure it. There were no fixed combat tours. An American pilot might rotate home after a set number of missions. A German pilot flew until he was wounded, captured, or killed. Over time, this allowed skilled men to accumulate staggering victory totals. Each confirmed shootdown was meticulously recorded. Each success reinforced reputation. And reputation in the Luftwaffe mattered. By 1944, Wolfram had become one of those names, a pilot whose tally climbed past 100 confirmed victories, 137 by war's end, the majority in the Bf-109, an aircraft that had been the backbone of German fighter forces since the late 1930s. The Messerschmitt was not forgiving. Its narrow landing gear made takeoffs and landings treacherous. Its cockpit was tight, visibility limited. But in the air, in the hands of an experienced pilot, it was lethal. German fighter doctrine emphasized altitude advantage, climb performance, and vertical maneuvering. The idea was simple: own the sky above the enemy. Attack from higher altitude, strike fast, then climb away before a counterattack could form. Energy retention, the balance between speed and altitude, was everything. German pilots were trained to fight in the vertical plane, converting speed into climb and climb back into diving attacks. It was a disciplined, calculated style of combat that rewarded patience and punished recklessness. Against early war opponents, it worked brilliantly. But by 1944, the air war over Europe was no longer what it had been in 1940. On the Western Front, American heavy bombers pushed deeper into German airspace with each passing month. The skies above the Reich became a battlefield of staggering scale. Hundreds, sometimes more than 1,000 aircraft in a single day. Escort fighters now ranged farther than German planners once believed possible. Fuel shortages tightened. Training hours for new pilots shrank dramatically. Veterans like Wolfram found themselves flying alongside teenagers with only a fraction of their experience. And yet, inside the cockpit of his Bf-109, the illusion of superiority could still feel real. When you have survived hundreds of sorties, when your reflexes are sharpened by constant combat, when your aircraft responds like an extension of your own body, it is easy to believe that skill alone can turn the tide. Wolfram's record seemed to prove it. 137 enemy aircraft destroyed, a personal war fought at 20,000 feet, measured in split seconds and bursts of cannon fire. But numbers can deceive. Many of those victories were scored in the East, where Soviet aircraft, particularly in the early years, were often technologically inferior and flown by less experienced crews. The Western Front was different. There, German pilots faced opponents flying robust, heavily armed fighters backed by an industrial machine that replaced losses faster than Germany could train new men. The balance was shifting, not necessarily in individual dogfights, but in the larger equation of production, fuel, and attrition. Still, to the outside observer, and even to many within Germany, the existence of high-scoring aces like Wolfram reinforced a powerful narrative. The Luftwaffe was wounded, perhaps, but not defeated. Its elite still hunted in the skies. Its doctrine still produced killers. The myth of German air superiority lingered, sustained by propaganda and by the very real skill of its surviving veterans. In that world, Walter Wolfram stood as proof that the old ways still worked. Climb higher, dive faster, strike first, survive. But war is not decided by individual duels alone. It is decided by systems, by logistics, by range, by who controls not just the altitude of a single engagement, but the entire battle space. And soon, Wolfram would confront an aircraft that challenged everything he thought he understood about air combat, an aircraft whose strengths were not built around short vertical duels over the front lines, but around something far more dangerous: endurance. Before he ever sat in its cockpit, before he ever spoke the words that would unsettle his superiors, the stage had already been set. The hunter of the Reich was about to meet the machine that hunted the Reich itself. In 1940, Britain was fighting for survival. The skies above southern England had become a battleground, and the Royal Air Force needed fighters, fast. Not in 2 years, not after endless prototype testing. They needed them immediately. So the British turned to an American company that, at the time, had never built a frontline fighter for combat in Europe: North American Aviation. The request was simple: produce more Curtiss P-40s under license. But the response was bold. North American's engineers believed they could design something better and do it quickly. In an astonishing burst of industrial urgency, the company produced a prototype in just 117 days. The aircraft was sleek, modern, and aerodynamically clean. It would become known as the North American P-51 Mustang. At first, however, it was not the war-winning machine history would remember. The early Mustang models were powered by the Allison V1710 engine. At low altitudes, the aircraft was fast and responsive. In fact, at treetop level, it outperformed many contemporary fighters. But there was a problem, one that would nearly doom the design. Above 15,000 feet, where the air war over Europe was increasingly being fought, performance dropped sharply. The Allison engine lacked an effective high-altitude supercharger. In a war defined by bomber formations cruising at extreme heights, that limitation was fatal. For a time, the Mustang was relegated to reconnaissance and ground attack roles. It was useful, it was capable, but it was not yet revolutionary. The breakthrough came not from America, but from Britain. Engineers at Rolls-Royce had been refining one of the most advanced piston engines of the war, the Merlin. The Rolls-Royce Merlin was already powering the legendary Supermarine Spitfire and the Avro Lancaster. It featured a sophisticated two-stage, two-speed supercharger that maintained power at high altitude. British engineers wondered what would happen if the Mustang's sleek airframe were paired with the Merlin's high-altitude performance. The result was transformative. When the Merlin engine was fitted into the Mustang airframe, the aircraft's personality changed completely. Suddenly, it could climb aggressively at altitude. Suddenly, it could match and even surpass German fighters above 25,000 feet. The combination of American aerodynamic design and British engine technology created something neither nation had achieved alone. But the engine was only part of the story. The Mustang featured a laminar flow wing, a design intended to reduce aerodynamic drag by allowing air to flow smoothly over a greater portion of the wing's surface. In theory, this reduced resistance and increased speed and efficiency. In practice, especially under combat conditions, the effect was not as perfectly smooth as engineers had hoped. Dirt, paint imperfections, and battle damage disrupted airflow. Yet even with these imperfections, the Mustang remained exceptionally efficient at high speed. Efficiency meant range, and range was the true revolution. Until the Mustang matured into its Merlin-powered form, American heavy bombers flying from England faced a deadly gap in protection. Fighters like the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt and the Lockheed P-38 Lightning were formidable, but early versions lacked the range to escort bombers all the way to deep targets like Berlin. Once the escorts turned back, German fighters struck. The results in 1943 were catastrophic. Raids such as Schweinfurt-Regensburg saw bomber losses so severe that American strategy teetered on collapse. Crews called the unescorted segment of their missions the longest mile. German interceptors waited with altitude advantage, climbing into tight bomber formations and attacking again and again. The Luftwaffe's doctrine was designed for exactly this kind of fight. Short-range interceptors rising to meet bombers over their own territory, fast, concentrated strikes, then land, refuel, rearm, repeat. The Merlin-powered Mustang destroyed that equation. With drop tanks extending its operational range dramatically, the P-51 could escort bombers from England to Berlin and back. It did not simply protect them near the coast, it stayed. It hunted ahead of the formations. It swept German airfields. It engaged interceptors before they could mass their attacks. For the first time, the bombers had continuous fighter cover over the heart of the Reich. The strategic implications were enormous. The air war shifted from a contest of interception to a war of attrition. German fighters were no longer choosing when to engage. They were being engaged, often by opponents who had the fuel to pursue them all the way home. The Mustang could dive, climb, and accelerate with deadly efficiency. Its 6.50 caliber machine guns delivered sustained firepower. Its visibility, particularly in the later bubble canopy P-51D models, gave pilots a clearer view of threats in every direction. But perhaps its greatest weapon was endurance. Endurance meant presence. Presence meant pressure. Pressure meant exhaustion. German pilots who once relied on altitude advantage began to find Mustangs already above them. Those who dove away discovered that the American fighter could follow and still have fuel to spare. The skies over Germany became crowded not just with bombers, but with escorts that refused to leave. In Berlin, in early 1944, this reality became impossible to ignore. The industrial heart of Germany was no longer protected by distance. The Reich's capital, once beyond the safe reach of American fighters, now lay within the Mustang's range. And when long-range escorts appear over your capital city, the message is unmistakable. For men like Walter Wolfram, who had built their reputations on tactical skill and aggressive vertical combat, a new kind of threat was emerging. This was not simply a faster opponent or a tighter-turning adversary. It was an aircraft built around strategic reach. It represented a shift from localized dogfights to sustained air dominance. The Mustang was not invincible. It could be outturned at low speed, it could be surprised, it could be shot down, but it changed the geometry of the war. It erased sanctuary, it erased distance, and in doing so, it forced the Luftwaffe into a battle it was never designed to win. Not a battle of individual skill, but a battle of industrial capacity and operational endurance. Some German commanders recognized the danger immediately. Others clung to the belief that superior tactics and experienced aces could offset the imbalance. After all, the Luftwaffe still had men like Wolfram, pilots who had survived hundreds of engagements. But technology had shifted the battlefield beneath their wings. The machine they once dismissed as just another American fighter was becoming something else entirely. Not merely an escort, not merely a dogfighter. It was becoming the instrument that would carry the air war to the very center of the Reich and keep it there. By late 1943, the air war over Europe had reached a breaking point. American heavy bombers were striking deeper into German territory than ever before, but the cost was staggering. Without continuous escort, formations of B-17s and B-24s were being torn apart by coordinated interceptor attacks. German fighters climbed into tight defensive boxes, firing cannon shells into aluminum holes packed with fuel and explosives. Entire crews vanished in fireballs over cities they had never seen before. Then, in early 1944, something changed. The arrival of large numbers of Merlin-powered P-51 Mustangs coincided with a new American strategy. Instead of keeping escort fighters tightly tethered to bomber formations, commanders began allowing them to roam ahead, sweep flanks, and aggressively hunt German interceptors. The goal was no longer just protection, it was destruction. The United States Army Air Forces wanted to break the back of the Luftwaffe entirely. The skies over the Reich became a vast, chaotic battlefield. On some days, more than 1,000 American bombers crossed into German airspace, accompanied by hundreds of escort fighters. Contrails streaked across the upper atmosphere in parallel white lines. Radar stations lit up, sirens wailed. German pilots scrambled from airfields scattered across the country. For experienced aces like Walter Wolfram, this was a different kind of war than the one they had known in the East. There, combat had often been fluid and localized. Here, it was industrial in scale. Engagements were no longer brief clashes between small formations. They were swirling, multi-layered battles that could stretch for miles and last for hours. The Mustang altered the rhythm of these fights. It climbed well at altitude. It retained energy in a dive. It could stay in the fight far longer than many German pilots expected. And critically, it had range that erased Germany's strategic depth. In previous years, German commanders relied on geography as a buffer. Fighters could concentrate near likely targets, launch interception attacks, and withdraw to refuel while bombers continued deeper inland, often unescorted. Now Mustangs followed them across the entire route. There was no safe corridor. Fuel shortages compounded the crisis. By 1944, Allied bombing campaigns were systematically targeting synthetic fuel plants and refineries. Production plummeted. Training hours for new pilots were drastically reduced. Where veteran Luftwaffe pilots once trained extensively in aerobatics and gunnery, replacements now arrived at operational units with minimal experience. Some had barely practiced formation flying before being thrown into combat against seasoned Allied squadrons. The disparity was stark. American pilots rotated home after completing a tour of missions, allowing them to pass on combat lessons to fresh trainees. Luftwaffe pilots, by contrast, flew continuously. Veterans like Wolfram carried enormous burdens. They were expected not only to fight, but to mentor green wingmen in the middle of active engagements. Despite this, the Luftwaffe did not collapse overnight. German fighters remained dangerous. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf Fw-190 were still formidable machines. In skilled hands, they could outclimb, out-accelerate, and outturn their opponents in specific situations. Individual dogfights could still end with American aircraft spiraling toward the earth. But the balance of attrition was shifting decisively.
American industry replaced lost aircraft at a pace Germany could not match. Every downed Mustang was often replaced within weeks. Every lost German pilot was irreplaceable. By the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe was losing experienced leaders faster than it could train successors. Squadrons that once prided themselves on discipline and cohesion were now patchworks of exhausted veterans and frightened newcomers. Over Berlin, the psychological impact was profound. For years, Nazi leadership had assured the population that the capital was secure. Anti-aircraft guns ringed the city, searchlights probed the night skies. Yet now, in broad daylight, formations of American bombers appeared overhead, with fighter escorts weaving confidently around them. Civilians could see the silver shapes glinting in sunlight. They could hear the engines long before the bombs fell. Hermann Goering, commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, had once boasted that no enemy bomber would ever reach the Ruhr. As Mustangs began appearing regularly over Berlin itself, that claim rang hollow. According to later accounts, Goering reportedly remarked that when he saw American fighters over the capital, he understood the gravity of the situation. Whether phrased exactly that way or not, the sentiment reflected a hard truth. The air war was no longer being fought at Germany's borders, it was being fought at its core. For German pilots, encounters with P-51s became increasingly common. Some described them as persistent, difficult to shake. Others respected their speed and stability in high-speed dives. While early assumptions had dismissed American fighters as inferior in maneuverability, combat experience forced a reassessment. The Mustang was not unbeatable, but it was versatile. It could engage, disengage, and re-engage on its own terms. The Luftwaffe's traditional doctrine, climb above, dive through, withdraw, was becoming harder to execute when enemy fighters were already present at altitude. German formations attempting to assemble for coordinated attacks often found themselves intercepted before ever reaching their primary targets. This was precisely the American objective. By mid-1944, the United States Army Air Forces had shifted focus from merely defending bombers to actively seeking air superiority through attrition. Fighter groups were encouraged to strafe airfields, attack aircraft on takeoff and landing, and destroy infrastructure on the ground. The war expanded beyond the sky into hangars and runways. Even surviving a dogfight no longer guaranteed safety. For aces like Wolfram, the transformation was undeniable. The fight was no longer about isolated skill or individual bravery. It was about endurance under relentless pressure. Every mission carried higher risk. Every takeoff could lead to overwhelming numbers overhead. Yet the myth of German air superiority lingered in fragments. High-scoring aces still existed. Official communiques still reported victories. Newspapers still celebrated decorated pilots. From a distance, it appeared that the Luftwaffe retained its edge. But beneath the surface, the structure was eroding. The introduction of long-range escort fighters like the Mustang did more than protect bombers. It forced the Luftwaffe into a defensive posture it was never designed to sustain. It stretched limited fuel supplies. It exposed inexperienced pilots to unforgiving combat. It turned Germany's own airspace into a constant battleground. And for the first time, some German pilots began to sense that the air war was slipping beyond recovery, not because they lacked courage and not because their aircraft were obsolete, but because the strategic equation had changed. The sky over the Reich was no longer theirs to control. It was becoming contested, crowded, and increasingly dominated by aircraft that could fly farther, stay longer, and return the next day in even greater numbers. For Walter Wolfram, whose career had been built on mastery of the vertical fight, the coming confrontation would not simply test his skill, it would test his assumptions. Soon he would confront the very aircraft reshaping the battlefield, not in the chaos of combat, but in the calm clarity of evaluation. And what he concluded would echo far beyond a single flight.
By 1944, Germany was not only fighting Allied aircraft in the skies, it was studying them on the ground. Whenever a relatively intact enemy fighter crash-landed or was forced down in occupied territory, specialized recovery teams moved quickly. Aircraft were dismantled, transported, and in some cases restored to flying condition. At evaluation centers such as Rechlin, German engineers and test pilots analyzed performance, armament, structural design, and weaknesses. Intelligence was no longer optional, it was survival. Among the aircraft that drew particular attention was the American P-51 Mustang. At first glance, it did not look radically different from other single-seat fighters of the era. Sleek fuselage, low-mounted wings, bubble canopy on later variants. But German analysts already knew the statistics. Speed exceeding 430 miles per hour in certain configurations, operational range that allowed it to escort bombers from England to Berlin and back, 6.50 caliber machine guns with ample ammunition, and above all, the high-altitude performance delivered by its Packard-built Merlin engine. Eventually, at least one captured Mustang was restored to flight condition, and it would not be tested by a novice. Walter Wolfram, frontline ace, veteran of hundreds of sorties, was given the opportunity to examine and fly the very aircraft that had begun to dominate the Reich's skies. For a pilot who had built his reputation inside the cramped cockpit of the Messerschmitt Bf 109, the experience was bound to be revealing. Climbing into the Mustang, the first difference was immediate. The cockpit felt spacious compared to the narrow confines of the 109. The canopy provided improved all-around visibility. The layout of instruments appeared more ergonomically arranged. German fighters had been designed with performance priority. Comfort was secondary. The Mustang reflected a different philosophy, one that considered pilot workload, endurance, and situational awareness as combat multipliers. For a veteran accustomed to limited rear visibility in the 109, the Mustang's canopy was striking. In high-speed combat, the ability to see an approaching threat seconds earlier could mean survival. Those seconds were everything. Then came the engine. Advancing the throttle unleashed the smooth, powerful response of the Merlin. Unlike some German engines that demanded careful management under certain conditions, the Mustang's power plant delivered consistent performance at altitude. Acceleration in level flight was impressive. High-speed handling felt stable. The aircraft did not exhibit the abrupt stall characteristics that could catch an inexperienced pilot off guard in tighter turning fighters. Yet the Mustang was not flawless. In lower-speed turning engagements, especially against lighter aircraft, it could be outmaneuvered. German pilots who forced Mustangs into tight, sustained turns sometimes gained advantage. The Bf 109, particularly in vertical climbs, could still compete, but these were tactical windows, brief opportunities in a much larger strategic picture. What reportedly struck Wolfram most was balance. The Mustang was not built solely for short, violent interceptions over friendly territory. It was designed for range, endurance, and stability in long-duration missions. It could cruise efficiently for hours, then enter combat with retained energy. It was forgiving enough for relatively young pilots, yet potent enough in the hands of veterans. When Wolfram described it as a fine airplane, the phrase carried weight precisely because it came from an adversary with 137 victories. This was not propaganda from Allied sources. This was a Luftwaffe ace acknowledging the quality of the machine reshaping the air war. Such admissions were uncomfortable. German high command understood that technical evaluation required honesty, but morale required confidence.
If frontline heroes openly conceded that the enemy possessed superior tools in critical areas, what did that imply about Germany's chances? The Luftwaffe had long relied on qualitative superiority, better tactics, better pilots, superior climb performance. The Mustang challenged that narrative not by being unbeatable in a dogfight, but by excelling across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Range meant bombers were no longer exposed. Speed meant interception windows narrowed. High-altitude power meant vertical escape was no longer guaranteed. Visibility meant surprise was harder to achieve. In the controlled environment of a test flight, stripped of gunfire and chaos, these realities became clearer. The Mustang was not simply another opponent to outfly. It represented a shift in industrial and operational philosophy. It reflected American production capacity, Allied cooperation, and strategic patience. For Wolfram, the evaluation was technical. For his superiors, it was symbolic. If an ace of his caliber acknowledged the strengths of the Mustang, then the issue was no longer individual skill, it was structural. Germany could still produce excellent aircraft. Advanced designs like the FW-190D or the emerging Me-262 jet promised raw performance. But fuel shortages, pilot attrition, and relentless bombing campaigns limited their impact. The captured Mustang sitting on a German airfield was more than an enemy fighter. It was evidence of a widening gap. It demonstrated what happened when aerodynamic efficiency met high-octane fuel abundance, when a nation could refine, test, and mass-produce improvements without interruption, when escort doctrine evolved from defensive tethering to aggressive dominance. After stepping out of the cockpit, Wolfram returned to his own aircraft, a machine he knew intimately, one that had carried him through countless engagements. But perspective had shifted. It is one thing to fight an opponent at a distance, glimpsed through gun sights. It is another to sit in his cockpit, feel his engine, and understand his design logic. Whatever words were exchanged in debriefing rooms, the conclusion was difficult to ignore. The Mustang was not a lucky anomaly. It was the logical outcome of a strategic approach that prioritized range, pilot survivability, and sustained pressure. And if that approach continued unchecked, the Luftwaffe would face not isolated raids, but a permanent presence in its own skies. The hunter examined the machine hunting his homeland, and in recognizing its quality, he also recognized a deeper truth. The air war was no longer decided by who could climb fastest for a single engagement. It was being decided by who could return tomorrow, again and again, without running out of fuel, pilots, or factories.
By the beginning of 1945, the question was no longer whether Germany could regain air superiority. The question was how long the Luftwaffe could continue to function at all. The transformation had not happened in a single battle. It had not been decided by one duel or one innovation. It was the cumulative effect of relentless pressure, industrial, logistical, and strategic. And at the center of that pressure was an aircraft that symbolized the shift, the North American P-51 Mustang. When the Mustang began escorting bombers all the way to Berlin, it did more than protect aluminum formations in the sky. It forced Germany into a defensive spiral it could not escape. Synthetic fuel plants were targeted repeatedly, rail networks were shattered, aircraft factories were bombed faster than they could repair damage. Every loss became harder to replace. Fuel became the silent killer of the Luftwaffe. By late 1944, many German pilots trained on minimal flight hours. Some had barely practiced instrument flying before being committed to combat. Veterans like Walter Wolfram found themselves leading formations of inexperienced wingmen into skies filled with aggressive Allied escorts. Skill could still win individual engagements, but skill could not manufacture aviation gasoline. The attrition was merciless. American fighter groups began strafing German airfields directly, destroying aircraft on the ground before they could even take off. Runways were cratered, hangars burned. Even when advanced aircraft such as the Me-262 jet entered service, their impact was constrained by fuel shortages and overwhelming Allied presence. A revolutionary machine grounded by empty tanks was simply metal. The Mustang's endurance amplified every Allied advantage. It could loiter over targets, pursue fleeing fighters, and return with fuel reserves. It gave American commanders flexibility. Fighters were no longer tied exclusively to bomber formations. They could sweep ahead, disrupt assembly points, and intercept German units before they reached altitude. The initiative shifted permanently. Psychologically, the effect was profound. German civilians saw American fighters overhead in broad daylight. The capital itself was no longer distant from the front. The myth that geography could protect the Reich had evaporated. As escort fighters appeared routinely over Berlin, even high-ranking officials understood the implications. The skies above Germany were no longer controlled, they were contested, and increasingly dominated by the enemy. For pilots like Walter Wolfram, the final months of the war were a study in contrast. On one hand, he remained a highly capable ace, flying the trusted Messerschmitt Bf-109 with discipline and experience earned through hundreds of sorties. On the other hand, the environment around him had fundamentally changed. Missions were flown under fuel constraints, replacement pilots lacked depth of training, radar coverage and communication networks were disrupted by bombing. Even when German fighters achieved tactical success, strategic reality remained unchanged. Bombers continued to arrive, escorts continued to appear, factories continued to burn. The Luftwaffe had once embodied innovation and daring. Early in the war, its integrated doctrine of fast-moving air power had stunned Europe. But by 1944 and 1945, it was fighting a different war, one defined by sustained industrial output and long-range dominance. The Mustang represented that new model perfectly, efficient, durable, and backed by an economy capable of producing thousands. In total, more than 15,000 P-51 Mustangs were built. Each one symbolized not just engineering achievement, but replacement capacity. Every loss could be absorbed. Every damaged aircraft could be repaired or substituted. Germany could not match that scale. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, it was not because German pilots had suddenly lost their skill. It was because the system supporting them had collapsed. Air depots were empty. Airfields were overrun. Production lines were shattered. Air superiority had shifted irreversibly. The Mustang did not win the war alone. It worked in concert with heavy bombers, ground forces, naval power, and Allied coordination. But it changed the geometry of the air war. It erased sanctuary. It removed distance as a defense. It ensured that the skies above the Reich were never again beyond reach. For Walter Wolfram, survival itself was remarkable. Many of his contemporaries did not live to see the end. He had witnessed the rise of German air power, its peak, and its steady erosion. He had fought in the East and the West. He had tested the enemy's most formidable fighter, and he had seen firsthand what it meant when technology, production, and strategy aligned against a shrinking force. The story of the Mustang is not merely about speed or firepower. It's about endurance, about the ability to project power consistently and return to do it again the next day. In modern warfare, that persistence can outweigh brilliance. In the end, the hunter of the Reich faced a reality that no amount of individual courage could reverse. The skies he once dominated became corridors for enemy formations stretching to the horizon. The advantage shifted from altitude and maneuver to range and sustainability. Air superiority was not lost in a single dramatic moment. It was worn away, mission by mission, factory by factory, pilot by pilot. And when the final flights were grounded and the engines fell silent, One truth remained clear. The war in the air had evolved beyond the duel. It had become a contest of systems. The Mustang embodied that system, and once it appeared over Berlin, the outcome was only a matter of time.